In the Marvel Universe, there are many kinds of powers. Some are given by accident. Some are taken through force. Others come from gods, science, or the stars. But mutants are born with theirs. They don't get powers from a radioactive spider or a gamma explosion. They don't make a choice. They are mutants because of something written into their DNA, something ancient, subtle, and powerful. It's called the X gene. Mutants are humans, but they carry a special variation in their genetic code, the X gene, that causes extraordinary powers to manifest, typically during adolescence. Sometimes the change is sudden, triggered by stress or trauma. Other times it builds slowly. The powers themselves vary wildly. Some mutants can control weather. Others shift shape. Some heal, some fly, some see the future. And some, like Charles Xavier, can read minds. But being a mutant in the Marvel world isn't just about power. It's about being different. And that difference comes with fear. For many people in the Marvel universe, mutants are not heroes, they're threats. Because unlike other superpowered individuals, mutants are everywhere, hiding in plain sight, unknown even to themselves. Anyone's child could become one. There is no experiment, no alien origin, no choice. Only potential. This fear becomes the foundation of the X-Men's story. From the very beginning, mutants have been a metaphor for race, for gender, for class, for identity. Their stories echo real-world struggles, how society reacts to those who don't fit the norm, who are born different, who can't hide what they are. In that world, Charles Xavier dreams of peace. A world where humans and mutants coexist. Where difference is not feared but accepted. He founds a school, the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. But it's more than a school. It's a refuge. There, young mutants are taught to control their powers, to understand them, to use them responsibly. But also to feel safe. To be sane. To belong. Because for many of them, the world outside doesn't understand. Some were abandoned by their families, some were hunted, some simply ran, hopping to find somewhere they wouldn't be called dangerous. In the X-Men universe, being a mutant isn't about power. It's about identity. It's about walking into a room and knowing that people are already afraid of you. It's about hiding who you are to feel safe. Or choosing to reveal yourself and face the consequences. Some mutants try to live normal lives. Some wear masks. And some fight back. This tension between being born different and being punished for it runs through the entire history of the X-Men. And that's why the story resonates. Because behind the suits and the action and the names is something universal. A search for acceptance, for safety, for purpose, and above all, for a world that doesn't just tolerate difference, but embraces it. The story of the X-Men begins not with a battle but with an idea. In 1963, in the pages of Marvel Comics, a new kind of superhero team was introduced, one not brought together by fate or by accident but by shared identity. They were called the X-Men and they were mutants. Created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the X-Men debuted in X-Men 1. The world they entered was already populated by larger-than-life heroes, Spider-Man, Iron Man, Thor, the Fantastic Four. But the X-Men were different from the start. They weren't heroes because of their powers. They were feared because of them. The comic opens with a man, Professor Charles Xavier, watching young people train in a secret school. His students are unique. Each possesses a mutation, a gift triggered by the X gene. To the world, they're dangerous. But to Xavier, they're something else. They're the future. Charles Xavier is a powerful telepath, perhaps the most powerful mind on Earth. But his true strength lies in his vision. He believes that humans and mutants can live in harmony. That fear can be replaced with understanding. To protect the world and teach his students, he forms a team. He calls them the X-Men. Why that name? Some say it's because of the X gene, the source of their abilities. Others say it's because Xavier himself leads them. But in truth, the name carries something deeper. It marks them as something unknown. Something feared. Something other. The original lineup was small but iconic. Scott Summers, known as Cyclops, could emit powerful energy blasts from his eyes, a force so destructive, he must wear a visor at all times to control it. Jean Grey, called Marvel Girl, had telekinesis and eventually telepathy, but her true potential was still hidden. Hank McCoy or Beast was brilliant and agile, with enormous hands and feet. Later, his mutation would evolve further, transforming him physically. Bobby Drake or Iceman could generate ice and snow, covering his body in frost. And Warren Worthington III, known as Angel, had great feathered wings, a symbol of beauty and also of difference he couldn't hide. Together, they trained under Xavier's guidance. Their missions were small at first, battles with villains, encounters with other mutants, but even then the themes were clear. The X-Men weren't just fighting crime. They were fighting fear. They were protecting a world that didn't trust them. And sometimes that fear came not from strangers, but from family. As the comics progressed, another figure emerged, a contrast to Xavier's dream. Magneto. A mutant with the power to control magnetic fields, Magneto saw the world's fear not as something to soothe, but as something to resist. He believed that humans would never accept mutants, that coexistence was a fantasy. To him, the only path was domination. He formed the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, a name chosen by comic writers of the time, though Magneto himself would never have seen his group as evil. In the early stories, Magneto was a villain, a terrorist, a threat. But even then, there was something more beneath the surface. As years went on, writers revealed that Magneto had survived the Holocaust. He had seen firsthand what hate could do, what fear could justify. His rage, though dangerous, came from pain. And so, from the very beginning, the X-Men mythos was more than action. It was a mirror. A mirror held up to the world, asking who gets to belong, who gets left behind, and what happens when fear becomes law. The early X-Men stories weren't perfect. They reflected the time in which they were written, but they planted a seed. A team of outcasts. A school as sanctuary. A dream of peace always at risk. And at the center, two friends, Xavier and Magneto, walking opposite paths, bound by shared history and unspoken sorrow. This is where it began. A story of power, of difference, of a world divided by fear, and a small group of young people trying to change it. If there is one relationship that defines the X-Men universe, it's not romantic or even heroic. It's ideological. Charles Xavier and Eric Laneshire, better known as Professor X and Magneto, were once allies, and in some timelines even friends, but over time their paths diverged. Not because one was right and the other wrong, but because they saw the same truth and reacted in opposite ways. Both men are mutants. Both are powerful. Both have lost. But from loss they drew different lessons. Charles Xavier believes that peace is possible. He dreams of a world where humans and mutants live side by side, a world where fear gives way to understanding, where education, empathy, and conversation can overcome prejudice. His weapon is hope. That's why he creates the X-Men, not just to defend themselves, but to model what coexistence could look like. He trains young mutants to control their powers, not to fight back but to be accepted. He builds a school instead of a fortress. He teaches trust instead of retaliation. But hope has a cost, and not everyone can afford it. Eric Laneshire learned something different. As a child, he was imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp. His family was taken from him. He saw firsthand what hate could do when it was given authority. He believes that mutants will never be accepted, that humans will always fear what they don't understand. To Eric, history is clear. When the powerful fear the different, they destroy them. And so to survive, mutants must become more powerful. Magneto doesn't see himself as evil. He sees himself as prepared. Prepared for the war he believes is inevitable. To him, Xavier's dream is dangerous, not because it's wrong, but because it risks everything on the hope that humanity will change. And so their philosophies clash. Not because they hate each other, but because they both care deeply, painfully, about the future of their people. This is what makes their rivalry so unique. It's not about domination. It's about strategy. Charles wants to be trusted. Eric wants to be feared. Charles believes in inclusion. Eric believes in survival. And sometimes they're both right. There are moments in X-Men history when Xavier's trust is betrayed, when humans build weapons to destroy mutants, when laws are passed to monitor, regulate, or imprison them. Magneto sees these as confirmation. And there are times when Magneto's actions provoke fear, Times when he lashes out not just against the oppressors, but against entire cities, governments, or populations. Xavier sees these as tragedy. But in quiet moments in comics, in films, in animated series, they often meet. Not on the battlefield, but in conversation, in a chess game, in a hospital room, in a memories. Two men, two friends, two futures. Their relationship is not black and white, it is gray, complex, evolving. Sometimes they work together. Sometimes they try to destroy each other. But always they understand each other. Because deep down they want the same thing. A future where mutants don't have to hide. Don't have to fight. Don't have to be afraid. They just disagree on how to get there. And maybe that's what makes the X-Men so human. Because in the real world, when people face injustice, when they're excluded or feared or attacked, there are always different responses. Some want to build bridges. Some want to build walls. And the hardest truth of all is that both are trying to protect what they love. Hidden behind stone walls and a wrought iron gate in Westchester County, New York, stands a mansion. To the outside world, it looks like a private estate, quiet, secluded. But to those who know better, it is a refuge. A sanctuary. A place where mutants are not feared, but welcomed. This is Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters. It was founded by Professor Charles Xavier with a single goal: to give young mutants a place to learn, grow, and understand who they are. Because for many, mutation comes without warning. A child might wake up one morning unable to control their strength. A teenager might panic in a moment of fear and unleash something destructive. Some might glow. Some might vanish. Some might hear voices in their heads or see things that aren't there. And when that happens, the world often pulls away. Families are confused. Friends distance themselves. Authorities intervene. So Charles built something different. He didn't call it a fortress. He didn't call it a base. He called it a school. Because he believed education was the first step toward peace, that knowledge and understanding could do what fear never would. Inside its walls, students learn more than algebra or literature. They learn control. They learn that their powers aren't curses. They are part of who they are, but they don't have to define them. They train in the danger room, a technological marvel that simulates threats in a controlled environment. Here, students can practice safely, face their fears, and understand their limits. They take classes from instructors who are also mutants, teachers who once stood in their shoes. People like Storm, Beast, Wolverine, Kitty Pryde, Emma Frost, and of course Charles himself. But perhaps the most important lesson the school offers is that they're not alone. In the world outside, a mutant child might feel like a mistake. Here they are surrounded by others like them, each with different abilities, different stories, but the same question. Is there a place for me? At Xavier's, the answer is always yes. The school isn't without its dangers. It has been attacked, destroyed, rebuilt over and over again. Because there are those who fear what it represents, not just a building, but a future where difference is no longer a reason to divide. But the school always returns. Because the dream never ends. Sometimes the school is quiet, full of young students and laughter. Sometimes it becomes the headquarters of the X-Men, operating in secret. Sometimes it is lost. But it is always remembered. In every generation of X-Men, there are those who came through its halls. Some become heroes. Some leave. Some come back to teach the next class. But all of them carry something with them. The memory of the first place they felt safe. The first place they were told, you are not broken. The first place they understood that being different doesn't mean being alone. Xavier's school is not perfect. It has made mistakes. It has withheld truths. Sometimes it has failed to protect those inside. But it endures. Because it stands for something simple and deeply radical. That no matter who you are, no matter what your power is, no matter how much the world fears you still deserve to learn, to grow, to belong. And in that idea, the X-Men begin. Even in the earliest days of the X-Men, there were those who rejected peace. Not because they were cruel, but because they had lost faith in the world's ability to change. The most well-known of these was Magneto, mutant master of magnetism, who led a group with a name that carried fear, even in its title. The Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. The name itself was dramatic, a product of the 1960s comic era, but underneath the theatrics was something more serious. A group of mutants who refused to hide. While Professor X built a school, Magneto built a resistance. He saw no future in compromise, only submission. The Brotherhood was created to challenge the systems that sought to control, limit, or eradicate mutantkind. And its members each had their own reason for joining. Cyclone Mystique, a shapeshifter capable of assuming any form, had spent her life hiding. As a mutant, and in many versions of her story, also queer, she was used to passing as someone else to survive. Magneto offered her something she had never been promised: visibility. Fire, Pyro, and Avalanche, more traditional villains, joined for loyalty and ideology. They believed in strength, in dominance, in flipping the fear that mutants felt back onto the humans who created it. Cross Sabretooth, a brutal predator with feral instincts, followed chaos. His history with Wolverine, another key X-Man, added depth to their violent dynamic. And at times, Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch, Pietro and Wanda Maximoff were part of the Brotherhood too. Magneto was their father, and in the early comics they joined him out of family duty even as they struggled with his methods. Each version of the Brotherhood brought something new. Sometimes it was organized rebellion. Sometimes it was destructive protest. Always it was a rejection of human authority. To the public, the Brotherhood proved the worst fears about mutants. They were seen as terrorists, threats, monsters. But to some young mutants watching from the margins, they were truth-tellers. Proof that they didn't have to apologize for existing. That they could fight back. This duality, the X-Men on one side, the Brotherhood on the other, became the central conflict of early mutant stories. Two sides of the same truth. That the world was afraid of them. One side chose patience. The other chose power. And the question that kept returning was simple. Which side would you choose if it were your life on the line? The Brotherhood was not always united. Some members left. Some betrayed one another. Some, like Wanda, eventually fought for peace. But their existence reminded everyone of the stakes. That if the world treated mutants like enemies, mutants might become exactly that. Professor X knew this. And so did Magneto. Their war, philosophical, political, emotional, was now lived out through their students. And every clash between the X-Men and the Brotherhood wasn't just a battle. It was a question. Can difference ever truly be accepted, or will it always lead to war? The Brotherhood never gave a gentle answer. They gave a loud one. And sometimes the world listened. Not all threats to the X-Men wear costumes. Some come in suits, with official titles, with forms to sign and orders to follow. And some come in the form of towering metal machines, built for one purpose alone: to hunt mutants. They're called Sentinels. Massive humanoid robots engineered to detect, track, and neutralize anyone carrying the X gene. The first of their kind was introduced in X-Men 14, created by a scientist named Bolivar Trask. Trask didn't hate mutants exactly, but he feared them. He believed that mutation was the next step in evolution, and that humanity's survival depended on controlling or even eliminating that threat. So he did what many in power have done when faced with difference. He built weapons. The first Sentinels were mechanical giants, cold, logical, relentless. They could scan for mutant signatures, fly, adapt in battle, and coordinate with one another. Over time, they became more sophisticated, more efficient, and more terrifying. To many, they symbolized safety. To mutants, they symbolized extinction. And it wasn't just the machines. It was the system behind them. The government programs, the secret files, the surveillance projects. One of the most infamous was Project Wideawake, a U.S. initiative to monitor and preemptively control mutant activity. Funded quietly, staffed covertly, it worked to expand Sentinel technology and prepare for the so-called mutant threat. In some timelines and adaptations, this fear takes a darker turn. In the dystopian future shown in Days of Future Past, mutants are not just monitored, they are hunted, imprisoned, executed. In that world, Sentinels evolve into adaptive killing machines, able to replicate the powers of the mutants they fight. Entire cities fall under surveillance. Entire generations of mutants live and die in captivity. What begins as safety becomes genocide. But that future is not fiction to the characters who live in this world. It's a warning. And even in the present-day stories, the tension remains. Because Sentinels are not just tools. They are symbols. They show what happens when fear is scaled. When bias becomes policy. When survival for some means the destruction of others. The X-Men often fight Sentinels in battle, but the real fight is always deeper. It's about who gets to decide who is dangerous. Who gets to define what counts as a threat. And how far a government will go to protect itself from change. Some humans join the cause out of genuine fear. Others out of prejudice. And some quietly out of profit. Weapons contracts, political power, influence. The mutant question becomes a political one. Should they be registered? Controlled? Cured? Every debate leads to a darker possibility. And through it all, the Sentinels keep marching. Silent, cold, unfeeling. They do not hate, but they do not understand. And that is what makes them so dangerous. Because hate can be reasoned with. But automation, bureaucracy, policy, that can go unchecked for generations. The X-Men fight Sentinels not because they're machines, but because they represent a world that has already decided what mutants are and what they're worth. And that decision is always made from a distance. Never in the classroom. Never in the streets where mutants live. Never in the homes they build or the lives they led. Just in silence. From above. And the only sound that follows is the whirring of metal wings descending. Of all the stories in the X-Men universe, few carry as much weight or sorrow as the story of Jean Grey and the Phoenix Force. It begins not with fire but with sacrifice. Jean Grey, one of the original X-Men, was always powerful. A telepath and telekinetic, her gifts grew over time, deepening as she matured. But in the early years, her powers were considered limited, often overshadowed by others. That changed in a single moment. In the story known as the Phoenix Saga, Jean is aboard a space shuttle with her fellow X-Men, re-entering Earth's atmosphere after a mission gone wrong. The shuttle is damaged. Radiation floods the cockpit. Jean takes control. She uses her telepathy to absorb a pilot's knowledge, flies the shuttle herself, and shields the others from the solar radiation, risking her own life. They survive. But Jean does not. Or so it seems. When the X-Men awaken, she emerges from the water, alive, glowing, reborn. She calls herself Phoenix. At first, it's seen as evolution. Jean is stronger, braver. Her telekinetic power increases exponentially. She moves objects with a thought, reads minds with clarity, and begins to feel more than human. But it's not just growth. It's possession. Unbeknownst to her, Jean has become the host for a cosmic force, the Phoenix Force, an immortal, universal entity of life and destruction. It doesn't just amplify power. It overwhelms identity. Jean remains Jean until she doesn't. The transformation builds slowly, her emotions intensify, her desires grow darker, she becomes unpredictable, unstable. And then in the story's darkest chapter, the Dark Phoenix Saga, she breaks. Corrupted by manipulation, trauma, and the weight of godlike power, Jean loses control. She leaves Earth, travels to the stars, and in a single moment of hunger, she consumes the energy of a star, destroying an entire populated solar system in the process. Billions die. The galaxy watches in horror. Back on Earth, her friends, her family, and the X-Men are forced to confront the impossible. That someone they love may now be too dangerous to live. Jean returns, torn, conflicted, not fully herself, not fully the Phoenix. The X-Men try to help, to hold on to the person beneath the power. But others, including the alien Shi'ar Empire, demand justice. A final battle takes place on the moon. Jean briefly regains her mind. She sees what she has become. And in a moment of clarity, she chooses to end it. She sacrifices herself rather than risk becoming Dark Phoenix again. One of the most beloved X-Men dies, not in battle but by choice. to protect others, to free herself, to reclaim her soul. The story shook the world of comics when it was first published in 1980. At the time, heroes didn't die like this. They didn't fall this far, and they certainly didn't face such tragic human consequences. The Phoenix Saga redefined what superhero storytelling could be. It was no longer about villains and victories. It was about love, about loss, about the question at the heart of every power. What happens when you can do anything and lose who you are in the process? Jean Grey's story doesn't end there. She returns more than once through resurrection, timelines, reboots, and reimaginings. But no matter how many times she comes back, that fire still burns. The Phoenix, beautiful, terrible, eternal, it is not evil. It is not good. It is power pure and raw. And for Jean Grey, that power was both a gift and a curse. The X-Men never forget her. And neither do we. Because in her rise and fall, we see the most human truth of all. That sometimes our greatest strength is knowing when to let go. The X-Men are not just superheroes. They are symbols. From their very first appearance in 1963, mutants have stood for something larger than the panels of a comic book. They represent difference. Not the kind you choose. The kind you're born with. And how the world responds to that difference, with fear, rejection, violence, or compassion, is the central thread of the X-Men universe. This is what fans call the mutant metaphor. It's a lens through which real-world issues are explored in a fictional setting. In the X-Men, that metaphor has been used to reflect many struggles: civil rights, racism, immigration, queerness, disability, religion, anything that marks someone as other. When mutants discover their powers, it often mirrors a moment of identity awakening. It's not just a superpower emerging, it's a child realizing they are no longer safe in the world they once trusted. Mutants are feared not for what they do, but for what they might do. They are watched, registered, labeled. Governments debate how to control them, scientists propose cures. Entire communities rally against them without knowing their names. This isn't an alien invasion story. This is a social story, wrapped in costumes and battles, yes, but grounded in very real fear. In the 1960s, when the X-Men were created, America was in the middle of the civil rights movement. And while early issues didn't make overt political statements, the subtext was clear. Two philosophies were placed side by side. Charles Xavier, who believed in peace, dialogue, and integration. Magneto, who believed that only strength could protect his people. Many have drawn comparisons to real-world figures, Xavier as a stand-in for Martin Luther King Jr., and Magneto for Malcolm X. It's not a perfect match, but it gives context to the ideological divide. As time went on, the metaphor expanded. In the 1980s and 1990s, the X-Men began to reflect queer identity more openly, especially as AIDS ravaged communities the world ignored. Mutants were shown hiding their abilities from families, coming out, being shunned, being tested, even being targeted for medical experimentation. The phrase, "Have you tried not being a mutant?" appeared in a film adaptation. For many, it echoed things they had heard in their own lives. This is why the X-Men resonate. Because behind the battles and cosmic threats are questions that are deeply personal. Will I still be loved if I reveal who I am? Can the system protect me, or will it erase me? Am I dangerous just because I'm different? Even among the X-Men, the metaphor takes many forms. Some, like Nightcrawler, struggle with their appearance. His blue skin, tail, and glowing eyes make him visibly different. He finds comfort in faith but wrestles with rejection. Others, like Rogue, fear touch. Her power causes harm, creating isolation and longing. Beast, once a man with oversized hands and feet, later mutates further into a blue-furred creature. Even with his genius intellect, he is often judged first by appearance. Then there's Wolverine, who hides his pain beneath aggression. And Storm, a black woman who once walked as a goddess, now seen as a leader, a warrior, and a bridge between worlds. The X-Men don't just fight enemies. They fight stigma, loneliness, history. They carry the weight of being misunderstood. And yet they still choose to help. To protect the world that fears them. That choice, repeated again and again, is where the metaphor becomes most powerful. Because it reminds us that difference doesn't have to divide. It can inspire. It can teach. It can bring people together not because they're the same, but because they see each other clearly for the first time. The X-Men ask a question the world still struggles to answer. What kind of society do we want to be when faced with someone we don't understand? And in that question, we find their truths. The X-Men began with 5 students. But the world kept changing, and the school had to grow. Over time, new generations of mutants joined the cause not just to fight, but to find a place to belong. Each of them brought something new, a different background, a new fear, or a power they didn't yet understand. Some were born into a world where mutants were known. Some were born into war. All of them arrived with the same question. Is there a place for me? One of the most iconic new students was Kitty Pryde. She was just 13 when she discovered her mutation, the ability to phase through solid matter. A normal life slipped away overnight, but instead of being treated like a weapon, she was invited to Xavier's school. Kitty quickly became a symbol of youth in the X-Men, bright, curious, and courageous. She asked questions others wouldn't. She bonded with older students, challenged adults, and led with empathy. Later, she'd become a teacher herself. Then there was Jubilee, full of color and chaos, shooting energy bursts from her hands. She often masked her uncertainty with humor, but like many young mutants, she carried the weight of being pushed aside both by the world and her own family. Gambit, with his glowing eyes and charged playing cards, came from a shadowy past, a thief, a survivor. His charm was undeniable, but beneath it was a man constantly trying to outrun who he used to be. Rogue, with her white streak of hair and southern drawl, possessed one of the most tragic powers. She could absorb the memories, powers, and very life force of anyone she touched. A gift that also meant she couldn't safely hold someone's hand, or kiss, or hug without fear. Her strength was immense, but so was her loneliness. Nightcrawler brought a different kind of contrast. With blue fur, a tail, and the ability to teleport, he looked more like a demon than a man, but inside he was gentle, thoughtful, full of faith. He prayed often, not for safety but for understanding. Each of these characters deepened the X-Men mythos, not just by expanding the roster, but by showing the emotional complexity of what it meant to grow up mutant. They weren't perfect. Some made mistakes. Some left. Some returned. Some died. But all of them shaped what the X-Men became. New teams formed. The New Mutants, younger students learning together. X-Force, more aggressive and tactical. Generation X, students trying to survive both adolescence and prejudice. Every new class reflected its time. In the 80s and 90s, as culture shifted, so did the X-Men. They started to reflect the anxieties of a generation raised on war, disease, and political uncertainty. Mutants were no longer just feared, they were legislated, hunted, and isolated. These new generations responded not just with powers, but with perspective. They asked questions the originals hadn't. They didn't just want to fit into Xavier's dream. They wanted to redefine it. And so the X-Men evolved. The school became more than a classroom. It became a community. A place where trauma was acknowledged. Where growth was encouraged. Where survival didn't mean losing yourself. These new generations helped carry the legacy forward. They showed that the fight wasn't just about protecting the world. It was about shaping it. So that the next child who discovered their mutation wouldn't have to run. Wouldn't have to hide. Wouldn't have to wonder if they were the only one. They would know. Someone had already been there and left the door open behind them. Some stories take place in the future. Others are sent back to change it. In the world of the X-Men, one of the most iconic arcs is a story called Days of Future Past, first told in Uncanny X-Men 141-142 in 1981. It begins not with action but with silence. The future is bleak. Cities lie in ruin. Graves stretch across empty fields. And mutants once feared, then regulated, are now hunted to extinction. In this world, Sentinels rule. Not as individuals but as a system, programmed, logical, ruthless. They don't just target mutants anymore. They also imprison or eliminate any human who might sympathize with them. The line between safety and control has disappeared. The United States is a prison state. The X-Men are almost gone. The survivors live in hiding among them: Wolverine, Storm, Colossus, Kitty Pryde, and Magneto, older and changed. Together, they formulate a desperate plan. They don't try to fight the future. They try to change the past. Using telepathy and consciousness transfer, they send the mind of Kitty Pryde back in time into her younger body years before the fall began. Her mission is simple: prevent the assassination of Senator Robert Kelly. Because in the original timeline, that moment, the death of a powerful anti-mutant politician, triggered fear and retaliation. The government responded by fast-tracking Sentinel programs and mutant registration laws. The mutants pushed back. The conflict escalated until nothing was left. But if the X-Men can stop the assassination, maybe that future won't happen. Back in the past, the younger X-Men are shocked by Kitty's warning, but they trust her. They intervene. They confront the Brotherhood of evil mutants, now led by Mystique, who orchestrates the planned assassination. What follows is a tense, complex confrontation not just of powers but of ideology. Mystique believes eliminating Kelly will prevent further oppression. The X-Men believe it will only make things worse. And in the end, they succeed. Senator Kelly lives. But the future is not erased completely. It remains a possibility. A path the world can still choose or avoid. And that is what gives Days of Future Past its power. It is not a victory. It is a warning. It shows that the line between freedom and control is fragile. That hate can grow slowly, quietly, until it is law. And once fear is made legal, it becomes very difficult to undo. The story was one of the first in mainstream comics to show heroes losing, not in a single battle, but in the long arc of history. It asked, what if we fail, what if hope runs out? But it also asked something quieter. Is the future fixed, or can it be rewritten? Later adaptations, including animated series and the 2014 film, would revisit this storyline with variations. Sometimes it is Wolverine who travels back. Sometimes it is Bishop. Sometimes the details change. But the message stays the same. The future is not guaranteed. And neither is peace. Days of Future Past is a story about what happens when the world stops listening. When compromise fails. When fear wins. But it's also a story about the power of memory. About learning from the road ahead before you reach it. The X-Men don't just fight for today. They fight for tomorrow. Because they've seen what happens if they don't. In a world where mutants are hunted, feared, and exiled, the idea of a homeland sounds like a dream. A place where they aren't just tolerated but accepted. Celebrated. That dream became a place. Its name was Genosha. At first glance, Genosha was paradise, a wealthy island nation located off the southeastern coast of Africa. Its economy was booming, its cities were clean, its people lived in comfort. But beneath the surface was something far darker. Genosha's prosperity was built on the backs of enslaved mutants. In its earliest appearance in Uncanny X-Men 235, Genosha used its mutant citizens as a labor class. Children born with the X gene were taken by the government, stripped of their identities, and turned into mindless workers through technological and psychological conditioning. It wasn't just exploitation. It was systematic oppression. Mutants were processed, cataloged, and erased. The X-Men, once they learned of Genosha's truth, intervened. Battles were fought, secrets were exposed. But the damage was already done. And Genosha stood as a chilling example of what happens when power meets prejudice and gives it structure. Over time, things changed. Genosha began to reform. A new political order emerged. International pressure mounted. For a time, it seemed the nation might finally become what mutants had hoped for all along. A homeland. A place to call their own. In a dramatic turn of events, Magneto was given control of the island, a former terrorist now turned leader. For some, this was dangerous. For others, it was justice. Under Magneto's rule, Genosha declared independence as a mutant nation, a sovereign state, a safe haven. Mutants from around the world arrived, thousands, then tens of thousands. A population built from survivors. For a brief moment, Genosha became a symbol of possibility. But peace is fragile. And in New X-Men 115, written by Grant Morrison, tragedy struck. A mutant hunting machine called Wild Sentinels, directed by an unknown force, descended upon Genosha with no warning. In a single attack, 16 million mutants were killed. 16 million. Gone. It was the worst massacre in mutant history. No supervillain announcement. No final battles. Just silence. The X-Men arrived too late. The island was destroyed. Its people vaporized, buried, forgotten by the world that had already turned its back. Only a few survived. Among them, Emma Frost, who had taken on the role of teacher and advocate. She emerged from the rubble, transformed physically into her diamond form, a secondary mutation triggered by trauma. From that moment forward, Emma became a hardened figure in X-Men lore, her grief crystallized, both literally and emotionally. The loss of Genosha became a scar. Not just on the map, but on the mutant soul. It reminded everyone, Xavier, Magneto, the world, that no place is truly safe when hatred has the power to fly, target, and kill from a distance. Genosha wasn't the first attempt at a mutant nation. And it wouldn't be the last. Others followed. Asteroid M Utopia, later Krakoa. Each carried the weight of Genosha's fall. A warnings. A vow. That next times they would not wait for permission. They would not ask to be accepted. They would build something on their own terms. And if the world tried to take it again, they would be ready. But the memory remains. 16 million voices silenced in a single hour. And the question echoes still. What does it take to build a nation when the world is designed to erase you? Genosha never answered that question. But its loss ensures the X-Men and all mutants keep asking. Mutants had survived genocide, oppression, fear. They had lost cities, leaders, and even their future. But nothing prepared them for what came next. It wasn't a war. It wasn't a sentinel attack. It was a whisper. 3 words spoken into the fabric of reality. No more mutants. To understand those words, we have to understand the woman who said them. Wanda Maximoff, also known as the Scarlet Witch. A mutant. A sorceress. A daughter of Magneto. A former Avenger. Wanda's power was always complex. She could alter probability, shift outcomes, create luck or misfortune. But over time, that power evolved. It became reality manipulation, the ability to reshape existence itself. And that power came with a cost. Wanda suffered loss. Her children, who were not entirely real, vanished. Her memories fractured, her grip on reality weakened. In a moment of collapse, she lashed out. And people died. The Avengers and X-Men came together to decide what to do. Some wanted to help her. Others feared her. Some believed she could destroy the world. Faced with this, Wanda, or perhaps her subconscious, reshaped all of reality into something new. A world where mutants ruled. Where Magneto's dream had come true. Where humans were the minority. This was the House of M. Each hero was given a different life, a wish fulfilled. But something felt wrong. Eventually, reality unraveled, the truth returned. And when it did, Wanda spoke again. No more mutants. In that instant, the mutant population dropped from millions to just under 200. Not killed. Erased. Their powers vanished. The X-genes silent. Entire communities lost. This became known as decimation. And it was unlike anything mutants had faced before. Not violence. Not hate. But disappearance. People woke up no longer who they were. Powerless. Disconnected. Forgotten. The X-Men couldn't stop it. They couldn't reverse it. And they couldn't understand why it had happened. Some blamed Wanda. Some blamed Xavier. Some blamed themselves. But blame didn't change what had been lost. The mutant race had gone from endangered to almost extinct. Hope dimmed. The school remained open but felt empty. The dream was still alive, but it was quieter now. In the aftermath, new threats rose. The few mutants who remained became targets. The world saw an opportunity to finish what had begun long ago. And yet in all this the X-Men did not stop. They mourned, but they endured. Because decimation wasn't just a loss of power. It was a test of identity. What does it mean to be a mutant when the world has taken that part of you away? What remains when everything you were born with is gone? Some walked away, some took refuge, and some stood up again with no promise of victory, only the knowledge that someone else might need a place to stand. Later, a child would be born. A mutant child. The first since decimation. Her name was Hope, and with her a new chapter began. But that's a story for another time. For now, we remember the silence. The stillness after the storm. The moment a whisper changed the world. Sometimes the greatest threat doesn't come from a weapon. It comes from within. In the 1990s, X-Men comics introduced a storyline that shifted from political tension and physical conflict to something far more intimate. A virus, a disease that attacked mutants specifically. Its name was the Legacy Virus, and its impact would change everything. It began quietly. One mutant, then two, then more. The symptoms were slow, subtle power surges, pain, weakening, and then death. At first, no one knew what it was or where it came from. Then came the truths. The virus had been engineered, a bioweapon, created by a time-traveling mutant named Strife, a clone of Cable born out of resentment and vengeance. He designed the virus to destroy what he saw as a failed legacy, the future he had inherited, hence the name. Legacy. But what started as one man's vendetta quickly became a crisis. There was no cure, no immunities, only a slow, terrifying spread. The Legacy virus targeted mutants exclusively. And because of that, it became more than a disease. It became a mirror, reflecting how the world treats those it doesn't understand. Some humans saw it as justice, as nature correcting itself. Others, especially mutants, saw it as a death sentence written in silence. The X-Men tried to help. They brought in scientists, doctors, telepaths. But nothing worked. One by one, mutants began to die. Characters we knew, loved, fought beside. Each death reminded readers and characters that powers don't guarantee survival. The virus took Ileana Rasputin, sister to Colossus. A child. Gone. The loss shattered him. The virus also infected Moira MacTaggart, a human ally and one of the world's foremost geneticists. She didn't die from it, but her suffering added to the growing fear. As the virus spread, the mood of the X-Men shifted. Hope dimmed. The dream felt distant. Some began to ask, if even mutants' biology can betray them, what future is left? Eventually, a cure was found. But it came with a price. The only way to release the cure was to trigger it with a mutant's death. And one man volunteered. Colossus. Still mourning his sister, still broken from loss, he chose to sacrifice himself. He entered the chamber, released the cure, and died. The virus ended that day. But the grief did not. Because the Legacy virus wasn't just a plotline. It was a reflection of real-world fears. It echoed the AIDS crisis, which was unfolding in the real world during the time these stories were told. A disease misunderstood, feared, politicized, ignored. Communities were left to mourn while others looked away. The X-Men brought that pain into the pages, not with spectacle but with sorrow. And in doing so, they gave readers a place to see their grief reflected. A place to remember. The Legacy virus eventually faded from the comics. But its emotional impact remained. It reminded us that not all threats come with battle cries. Some arrive quietly and stay too long. But even in the shadow of loss, there was courage. There were those who stayed, who fought for each other, who gave everything not to destroy but to heal. And in that healings, the X-Men found something deeper than survival. They found one another's. For decades, the X-Men fought to survive. They defended cities that didn't want them, saved people who feared them, mourned friends lost to wars they never asked for. And still, the world did not change. After Genosha, after Decimation, after Extinction-level losses and betrayals, the mutants decided to stop waiting. They would no longer beg for a place in the world. They would create their own. That place was Krakoa, a living island, a sentient mutant being, an ecosystem that breathes, grows, remembers. Krakoa had appeared before in X-Men history, once long ago as a threat, a creature that swallowed the original team and nearly ended their story. But now it became something else. A partner, a home. In 2019, with writer Jonathan Hickman's House of X and Powers of X, the X-Men entered a new era. One of rebirths. One of revolutions. Krakoa was transformed into a sovereign mutant nation, recognized, though reluctantly, by the global community. It had its own language, its own flag, its own borders, and most importantly, it had its people. All mutants were welcomed, even those once considered enemies. Even Magneto, even Apocalypse. Old rivalries were set aside. Because for the first time in their history, mutants had more than a dream. They had a place. To enter Krakoa, mutants used gates, bioorganic portals that could connect any two locations in the world. Mutants could travel instantly, freely. A network born from mutant collaboration, a new kind of unity. On Krakoa, war was not the way. Structure was. A quiet council of 12 leaders governed the island, made up of mutants from all walks of life. Some were heroes. Some were killers. Some were in between. But they sat at the same table. Because power shared was power protected. The most radical change. Death was no longer permanent. Thanks to a group known as the Five, mutants had unlocked resurrection. Through a combination of powers, genetics, time control, duplication, telepathy, and more, they could bring back any mutant who died, body and mind intact. It wasn't science fiction. It was mutant evolution. This changed everything. Mutants no longer lived in fear of extinction. They lived with purpose. But with new power came new questions. Could resurrection be abused? What about souls? What about justice? The X-Men, now a global force, faced these ethical dilemmas daily. And yet, for all its challenges, Krakoa offered something no one had seen before. Peace. Children played without fear. Families reunited. Rogue and Gambit married. Wolverine found a home. Storm led her people. For a while, it worked. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Krakoa was more than a sanctuary. It was a statement that mutants were not a minority to be pitied. They were a people, a culture, a history, a future. Some in the world welcomed this. Others feared it. But the message was clear. The mutants were done asking. They would build their world on their own terms. And for the first time in their long, painful history, they weren't fighting for survival. They were living. For most of their history, the X-Men lived with loss. Every battle risked a life. Every mission carried the weight of sacrifice. And over the years, many did fall, sometimes for good. Jean Grey, Nightcrawler, Colossus, Cyclops, even Charles Xavier. But on Krakoa, that changed. Because for the first time in mutant history, death became reversible. This miracle wasn't magic. It wasn't divine. It was the product of 5 mutants, each with a unique gift, separate on their own but extraordinary when working together. They became known as the Five. Seedling Goldball's real name, Fabio Medina, once believed his power was a joke. He could create golden spheres from his body. But on Krakoa, it was discovered that these weren't just spheres. They were unfertilized eggs, the perfect biological starting point for cloning mutant bodies. DNA Proteus, son of Moira MacTaggart, could manipulate reality just enough to make those eggs viable. His power was once feared, unstable. Now it was part of something greater. Mantelpiece Tempest, who controlled time, matured the eggs in moments, growing new, fully developed mutant bodies. Test Tube Elixir, with the ability to heal and restore biological function, brought the bodies to life, activating their cells, their hearts, their breath. Brain Hope Summers, the final piece, didn't create anything herself, but could synchronize the powers of the others, ensuring precision, stability, and cohesion. Together, they could do the impossible. Bring back any mutant who had died. Not as a copy, but as themselves. And not just recently deceased mutants. Either, the resurrection protocols allowed for the return of anyone whose genetic and psychic imprint had been recorded by Cerebro. For decades, Cerebro had been used to find mutants. Now it became something else. A vessel of memory. With every update, it recorded the psychic signature of mutants across the globe, storing a version of their thoughts, feelings, and identity. So when a mutant died, their body could be regrown, and their mind could be restored. A soul reborn in full. This was more than resurrection. It was immortality. And it changed everything. Krakoa now had the power to protect its people from extinction, not just symbolically, but literally. If a mutant died in battle, they could return. If they were murdered, they could be restored. Even suicide, long a silent topic in mutant stories, could be met with compassion and renewal. But with this gift came questions. If death isn't permanent, does it still mean something? Is sacrifice less noble if one always returns? Who decides when someone is brought back or if? And what about mutants who don't want to return? Even among the five, these dilemmas were felt. They weren't gods. They were friends, working together, not for glory but for their people. Mutant society adapted around this new ability. Ceremonies were developed. Memorials became transitions. And with resurrection came responsibility. Those who abused the law, who violated Krakoan peace, could still be punished, even banished, because now the stakes weren't about survival, they were about trust. The resurrection protocols weren't perfect. Delays happened. Conflicts arose. Secrets were kept. But one thing was clear. The age of mutant fragility had ended. And in its place was something bold. A society where life wasn't taken for granted. Where memory and identity were protected. Where community meant never being alone in the dark. The five were not worshipped, but they were respected. Because they reminded mutants and readers of a truth that goes beyond powers or politics. That the future isn't just about survival. It's about what you do with the time you're given. And now, the X-Men had all the time they needed. A nation is more than land. It is law. It is leadership. It is the question of who decides and how. When the mutant nation of Krakoa was founded, it wasn't enough to build gates and grow a population. Mutants had to govern themselves. Not through force, through council. So they created something new and old. Something inspired by parliaments, tribal councils, monarchies, and utopias alike. They called it the Quiet Council. 12 mutants, 12 seats, one table. Together they would guide mutantkind into its future, balancing ideology, power, and perspective. The council was divided into 4 sections, each with symbolic and practical meaning. First Quarter Moon Autumn, the founders and visionaries. Charles Xavier, the dreamer, the architect of the school, now a nation builder. Magneto, once feared as a terrorist, now a statesman carrying hard truths. Apocalypse, one of the oldest mutants, a symbol of evolution and survival. These 3 anchored Krakoa's original vision, not always in agreement but united in purpose. Mutant dominance not through war but sovereignty. Snowflake Winter, the pragmatists and survivors. Mystique, a shapeshifter, spy and mother, known for secrets driven by personal motives. Exodus, a religious zealot old as history, devoted to mutant purity and destiny. Mr. Sinister, a geneticist, manipulator, and narcissist, brilliant, dangerous, unpredictable. This faction held the shadows, those who knew power from behind the curtain, not heroes, but necessary voices in the council's balance. Sun with Face Spring, the progressives and diplomats. Storm, a queen, a goddess, a voice of reason and empathy, beloved by many. Nightcrawler, a man of faith and compassion, committed to morality in a changing world. Emma Frost, former villain turned teacher and advocate for mutant culture and economy. These members spoke for the soul of Krakoa, for art, for ethics, for beauty and belief. Summer, the defenders and fighters. Sebastian Shaw, ruthless businessman, master of the Hellfire Trading Company. Kate Pryde, captain of the Marauders, protector of mutants who couldn't use Krakoa gates. These seats connected to trade, transport, and law enforcement, the practical muscles of a nation that needed both strength and subtlety. Together, these 12 governed Krakoa. Their decisions were final. Debates were held in secret. Votes were binding. There was no president, no king, no supreme leader. Only the tables. And sitting at that table required more than power. It required trust, fragile, conditional, but necessary. Because Krakoa was more than a refuge. It was an experiment. Could mutants live together across generations and ideologies? Could former enemies become co-leaders? Could Xavier and Magneto sit beside Apocalypse and not fall apart? And perhaps the hardest question, could the dream survive once it was real? The Quiet Council made decisions that shaped every part of mutant life. Who could be resurrected and when? How justice was carried out. What laws governed mutant kind? Early on, they passed 3 laws, simple, sacred. Make more mutants. Murder no mans. Respect this sacred land. Each law carried layers of meaning, biological, moral, territorial. And each forced mutants to think not as individuals, but as a people. But no council is perfect. Conflicts arose. Alliances shifted. Secrets were kept. And over time, cracks appeared in the foundation. Because power, even shared, always tests those who hold it. Yet for all its flaws, the Quiet Council endured. Not as a symbol of unity, but as a symbol of effort. Mutants, after centuries of exile and persecution, were now shaping their own world. Together, even when they disagreed, even when they failed. Because that's what government is. Not control, but continuity. And for mutants who had always lived on the edge of extinction, continuity was revolutionary. Some alliances are born in public. Others are born in secrets. When the nation of Krakoa rose, it appeared to be the result of decades of growth. Xavier's dream maturing, Magneto's vision tempered, and mutants finally uniting. But beneath that progress was a hidden truth. A third mind. A woman long thought to be human. A woman who had died. A woman who had returned again and again. Moira MacTaggart. For years, Moira was an ally of the X-Men, a brilliant scientist, a friend to Xavier, and a rare human who stood beside mutants. But in House of X 2019, her true nature was revealed. Moira wasn't just a friend. She was a mutant. And her power was unlike any other. Reincarnations. Every time she died, her life restarted not as someone new, but as herself, born again with all her memories from previous lives intact. She didn't live one life. She lived 10 and more. Each life was a new attempt, a new strategy. Sometimes she allied with Xavier. Sometimes Magneto. Sometimes Apocalypse. Sometimes even with humanity. But in every life, mutants lost. Every future ended in extinction. It didn't matter how peaceful they were, how powerful, how careful. The result was always the same. So in her 10th life, the one we are living now, Moira did something different. She brought Xavier and Magneto together. 2 men who had clashed for years. 2 ideologies that had divided a species. She showed them what she had seen. What the future always became. And she told them, we have to do it differently this time. They agreed. And from that agreement, Krakoa was born. Not just as a political sanctuary, but as a final attempt. A last chance to avoid extinction. But there was a catch. The truth of Moira's power was kept secret. Even from the Quiet Council. Even from the X-Men. Only Charles and Eric knew. And they carried that truth like a shadow behind every decision. Because now, every choice wasn't just about today. It was about defying fate. For Xavier, who had always believed in hope, this revelation was shattering. For Magneto, it was proof of what he feared most, that the world would never accept them. And yet together they acted. They worked as one. built the council, trained the five, planted Krakoa's seeds across the earth. But the burden weighed on them, because Moira had told them one more thing. If she died without a plan, everything would reset. Their future, their memories, their progress. Erased. And so in this life she stayed hidden. Living in secrecy, observing, recording. Not as a leader, not as a prophet, but as a woman who had lived too long and seen too much. Eventually, the truth would come out. Secrets unravel. Alliances fracture. The X-Men would learn that their nation was built on a truth they never knew and choices they never made. But in the quiet moments before that reckoning, there was unity. Charles and Eric, once enemies, stood side by side. Not because they believed in each other fully, but because they believed in the need to try. This alliance wasn't about trust. It was about survival. The kind of survival that bends morality, that redefines sacrifice. Because when every life ends in failure, you stop asking what's right, and you start asking what works. Moira's secret changed everything. It didn't erase the dream, but it rewrote the stakes. And now, with time against them, the question was no longer, can mutants survive? It was, can they survive without becoming something else entirely? In the middle of the X-Men's grand battles, their political crises, their philosophical wars, there is a quieter story. A story that never screams, that never takes center stage, but always lingers. The story of Scott Summers, Jean Grey, and Logan, better known as Cyclops, Phoenix, and Wolverine. Three of the most iconic mutants. Three of the most powerful. Three of the most complicated. And yet what binds them isn't just power. It's love. Not a fairy tale. Not a perfect romance. But something far more human. Love that aches. That endures. That hurts and still remains. Red circle Jean Grey. At the center is Jean, graceful, strong, empathetic. She was the heart of the original X-Men. The first girl in a house full of boys. The one with potential even she didn't fully understand. She didn't ask for greatness, but it came for hers. Jean's life was shaped by power and sacrifice, by death and rebirths, by becoming the Phoenix and losing herself to it. But through it all, two men stood close to her in different ways. Blue Circle Scott Summers, Cyclops. Scott was her first love. Reserved, responsible, always in control. His powers, beams of pure force from his eyes, required constant restraint. He wore glasses not for vision, but for containment. And perhaps so did his heart. With Jean, he softened. He let go. They loved one another deeply. They married, led teams together, carried the weight of leadership and of loss. But Scott was not perfect. He made mistakes. With Emma Frost, with choices that hurt. He grew darker over time, more militant. Yet his love for Jean never disappeared. And neither did hers for him. Logan, Wolverines. Then there was Logan's. The opposite of Scott in almost every way. Rough, unfiltered, wild. But with Jean, gentle. He didn't hide his desire. Didn't pretend to be indifferent. But he never forced it. He respected her choices even when they hurt. Jean saw in Logan something raw and real. A man who had suffered and still chose to care. Their connection was physical, emotional, spiritual. Brief sometimes, but meaningful. Logan never stopped loving her. Even when she died. Even when she came back. Even when she chose Scott. Broken heart between them. This triangle was never about drama. It was about timing. Pain. Responsibility. Three people shaped by war and death, trying to hold on to something tender. In recent years, with the founding of Krakoa, this relationship took a new turn. The rules changed. Scott and Jean rekindled their marriage. But Logan wasn't pushed away. They lived close, literally. Their rooms connected. The implication that their bond was no longer something hidden or denied. That gene didn't have to choose one against the other. That love could be complicated and still be true. Some fans call it a polyamorous relationship. Others see it as emotional openness. The comics don't always say, and maybe that's the point, that not all relationships need definitions. Some just need space to exist. What matters is this, that in a world full of chaos and fire, these three people found each other. Again and again. They hurt each other. They held each other. They never stopped trying. And in the end, that may be the bravest thing they ever did. The X-Men are often seen as heroes. But more than that, they are survivors. And within their stories lie the lives of mutants who, despite their strength, have been shaped by tragedy, not in a single event, but in the way the world has treated them from the beginning. This is their quiet moment, a remembrance of the ones who carry pain as part of their mutation. Broken Heart Nightcrawler Kurt Wagner's. Born with blue skin, yellow eyes, and a spaded tail, Nightcrawler looked like a demon even though he was anything but. He grew up in hiding, feared, chased, rejected by the world around him. And yet he found faith. Not in people's, not even in safety, but in the idea that kindness could exist even in darkness. Kurt smiled more than most. Not because he never felt pain, but because he had learned to carry it with grace. Gloves Rogue. For most of her life, Rogue couldn't touch anyone. Her powers absorb the memories, abilities, and even the life force of anyone she comes into contact with. Her first kiss put a boy into a coma. And from that moment, she pulled away. Gloves became armors. Distance became survival. She longed for closeness, for something simple. To hold a hand. To rest her head on someone's shoulder. Her tragedy wasn't death's. It was the absence of touch. A loneliness that never left. DNA legends David Haller. The son of Charles Xavier, David was born with a fractured mind, and inside that mind, dozens of personalities. Each one had its own power, its own voice, its own needs. Some wanted to help, some wanted to destroy. David lived in constant conflict, not with the world but within himself. Brilliant, terrifying, deeply misunderstood. His tragedy was identity, never knowing which version of himself was real or if he would ever be free from the noise. I blindfold Ruth Aldines. Ruth was born with no eyes, yet she could see the future. Her power was prophecy, unwanted, unasked for. She saw things others couldn't. She spoke in riddles. She lived between timelines, never fully anchored in the now. Her speech patterns, her demeanor, made others uncomfortable. But her heart was gentle, and her story ended in silence. A vision too painful to live with. A future too cruel to face. Her death was not loud, but it was felt. Iceman Bobby Drake. On the surface, Bobby was lighthearted. The jokester, the fun one. One of the original 5 X-Men, powerful, capable, charming. But inside, he was hiding. For decades, Bobby's sexuality was left unspoken, even to himself. Later stories would explore this more directly. Bobby is gay. But he spent years pretending. Years afraid of what that might mean. Not just as a man, but as a mutant. For someone who could turn to ice, the metaphor was always there. Cold on the outside. Longing for warmth inside. Brain Emma Frost. Known for her strength, for her pride, for her diamond-hard exterior, Emma Frost once lived a different life. Abused, controlled, humiliated. She fought her way to power not out of ambition but to protect herself. She became a teacher, a leader. And yes, sometimes a villain. But beneath the cold was someone who had learned that vulnerability came at a cost. Her tragedy was that her strength was mistaken for cruelty, when it was actually self-preservation. Each of these mutants, and many more, carry their scars in different ways. Some wear them openly. Some hide them beneath humor or anger or armor. But they all remind us that pain isn't weakness. It's the proof of survival. And in their stories, we see our own. In the quiet moments. In the silence after loss. In the longing for connection. These characters speak not through power but through truth. That even in a world of superhumans, the hardest battles are often the most personal. There are thousands of mutants in the Marvel Universe, but only some are called X-Men. Not because they're the strongest, not because they win the most fights, not even because they live at the school. The name means something more. So the question becomes, what makes someone an X-Man? The answer has changed over time. In the beginning, it meant being a student. One of Xavier's chosen. Learning, training, growing. Then it meant fighting back against threats to the world and to themselves. Later still, it meant protecting the innocent, even when they weren't mutants. But beneath all that, the truth remains. Being an X-Man isn't about power. It's about principle. Compass, the willingness to protect. Every X-Man, whether original or new, teacher or student, shares one common trait. They choose to stand between fear and hope. Sometimes it's on a battlefield. Sometimes it's in a classroom. Sometimes it's in a courtroom or a hospital or a ruined street. But always they show up. Even when they're outnumbered. Even when they're not trusted. Even when the people they protect would rather see them disappear. Being an X-Man means protecting a world. That does not always protect you. Handshake the choice to return. Many X-Men have left. Logan, Storm, Rogue, Gambit, Emma Frost. Some walked away in anger. Others in grief. Some just needed time. But they come back. Not because they owe anything. Not because they're perfect. But because they still believe in the cause. That someone has to be there for the next generation. To remind them they're not alone. To fight when others can't. Being an X-Man means coming back, even after pain, after loss, after silence. The mirror of identity. X-Men are not a fixed team. They are a reflection of whoever feels out of place. That's why the name has endured. Because the world keeps changing. And with it, the questions change too. What does it mean to be different? What do we owe each other? Can we forgive not just others but ourselves? The X-Men don't always have the answers. But they live the questions. That is their gift. That is their burden. Speech balloon, the unspoken creed. There's no oath, no pledge. But every X-Man lives by something unspoken. I will protect those who cannot protect themselves, even if they do not trust me, even if I am not thanked, even if I am not understood. That is what separates the X-Men from others. Not that they are more nobles, but that they are chosen by hardship and choose to rise anyway. DNA, anyone can be one. And here is the quiet truth. You don't need powers to be an X-Man. Moira was one. Forge was one. So was Gabrielle Haller, so was Callisto. So was Jubilee long before she understood herself. What makes someone an X-Man isn't mutation. It's the willingness to fight for those who are seen as less. It's the courage to say, you matters. You belongs. You are not alone. In the end, that is what the X-Men stand for. Not a team. Not a school. Not even a species. But a choice. To show up. To speak out. To lift others, especially when the world says not to. That's what makes someone an X-Man. And that's why their story continues. Because that choice is always waiting. For someone else to make it. The world has changed since 1963. Politics, technology, identity. The questions we ask. The truths we face. But through all of it, the X-Men remain. Not because of nostalgia. Not because of popularity. But because the story still speaks. It still matters. Because every generation feels out of place at some point. Feels misunderstood. Feels afraid. And the X-Men tell them, you are not alone. Books, a story that grows with us. When the X-Men were first created, they were teenagers with strange powers, training to save the world. But over time, they became more than that. They became mirrors for real-world struggles. Their metaphors deepened. Mutants as stand-ins for race, queerness, disability, and class. The fight for dignity in a world built on exclusion. The pain of losing a part of yourself to survive. The resilience of choosing love anyway. No other team in comics has been so consistently used to ask questions about identity. And no other team has welcomed so many kinds of people into its pages. That's why the X-Men endure. Because they evolve just like the people they represent. Balance between fear and hope. The world of the X-Men is not black and white. It is filled with ethical questions. What do you do when the law says you're dangerous? How do you build peace with someone who has hurt you? Can justice and forgiveness live side by side? The X-Men don't always get it right. But they try. And in trying, they show us how to keep going even when the world says stop. Brain memory and legacy. There have been many versions of the X-Men. Teams have formed, splintered, reformed. Characters have died and returned. Stories have been retold and rewritten. But some things never change. The mansion in Westchester. The bond between students. The dream of coexistence. And the cost of that dream. Because it's not just about living. It's about choosing how to live. And choosing to stand beside others even when it's hard. Especially then. DNA, a story that belongs to all of us. You don't have to be born a mutant to love the X-Men. You just have to know what it feels like. To be different. To be feared. To want something better. The X-Men have made space for outsiders, not just in story but in fandom. They've welcomed readers across cultures, genders, sexualities, and beliefs. They have shown that you can be strong and scared. Angry and kind. Flawed and still worthy. That you can change. That you can choose a better future. And if that isn't the heart of the human experience, what is? So why do the X-Men still matter? Because the world still needs them. Not just on the page, but in the quiet moments between pages. In the conversations they spark. In the courage they give. In the reminder that even if you're different, you still belong. And no matter how many times the world tries to forget that, the X-Men will always return. To fight, to teach, to dream, and to remind us that no matter where you come from, there's a place for you too. Whether you came here to relax, to focus, or to simply step away from the noise of the day, thank you for spending this time here. Sometimes stories give us answers. Sometimes they give us space to think. And sometimes they simply offer a quiet place to breathe. Wherever you are, in your room, at your desk, on a walk, or lying quietly in bed, may the stillness stay with you. If your eyes are heavy now, let them close. If your mind is clear, stay there. And if the world feels a little softer, then the story did its part. When you're ready, you can wake slowly or drift further. You're safe to rest here. Until next time, take care.